This is the lecture for European history for Wednesday, the 19th of May, 2021. You should have your notes out. Yes, I am turning. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, when they were in
So, we have been in the midst of turning point battles in the Second World War. And these turning point battles take the form of the Battle of the Atlantic, which is, this is a useless thing. The Battle of the Atlantic, which is the definitive battle of whether or not Britain can become starved out of the war, which the Germans tried in the First World War, and they're going to try again in the Second. Weapon of choice in both cases is the U-boat. That battle takes the entire war. The second turning point battle is in North Africa, the battle between the British and the Germans at El Alamein, where General Montgomery takes the fact that El Alamein is a geographical choke point and actually fights a World War I style battle in the midst of World War II and defeats the Germans, driving them back into the center of North Africa. This isn't a turning point battle, but it's related to El Alamein. Operation Torch allows American and British forces to land on the West African coast, Vichy French territory, and in doing so, the Vichy French, in some cases, resist because, well, they're Vichy French and they're collaborators with the Germans, and they resent the British and even the Americans for trying to save them from the Germans. What Operation Torch does, though, in relation to El Alamein, is it creates an Allied front in northwestern Africa to complement General Montgomery's Allied front in eastern Africa, to drive together on Tunis, which is in Tunisia, which is where the heart of the German and Italian power in North Africa is. Sorry to be lecturing with my back to you. Then we went to the big one as far as Europe is concerned. The drive of the Germans to the oil fields at Baku, which provoked the Germans to try to take the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River as an anchor point to protect the German flank as they moved southward across or to the Caucasus Mountains. And ultimately they hoped to cross them and get the oil at Baku, which is on the Caspian Sea. And at Stalingrad, from August 42 to February of 43, in a seven-month battle, the Germans are fought to a standstill by the massive numbers of Russian troops, and ultimately they are cut off, surrounded, starved. The attempt by the Luftwaffe to supply them from the air fails, and ultimately the forces there at Stalingrad surrender to the Russians. Tens of thousands of Russians are brought into captivity at Stalingrad. Fewer than 1,400 of them, that's 1,400, not 14,000, ever returned to Germany. The rest of those who surrendered are killed by labor in the gulags of the Soviet Union. So, now we shift back to the Pacific. In the Pacific, the Japanese are, and I've got to use this map, the Japanese control territory from the border of Burma and British India all the way into the Central Pacific. However, the American Navy does something which causes the Japanese to panic and react in anger and desperation. As a payback, a little bit of a payback for the Pearl Harbor attack, Americans put medium bombers, two-engined bombers, on an aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. Normally, Army bombers can't fit on an aircraft carrier. The crews of these bombers, led by James Doolittle, General Jimmy Doolittle, trained for months in short takeoffs from landing strips that have been reduced to the size of a carrier deck, or an equivalency. These American bombers on the USS Hornet, escorted by the USS Enterprise, steam secretly into Japanese waters. They are spotted by Japanese fishing boats at the outer range of the bombers. They had hoped to get closer to Japan before launching, but because the fishing boats spotted them and maybe radioed warning before they were sunk, the American bombers take off and wing their way towards Tokyo. In this Doolittle raid, American bombs fall on the capital city of Tokyo. They fall within sight of the emperor's home, the imperial palace. Now, I told you how bombs falling on Berlin changed the Battle of Britain from a battle that Germany was winning, destroying the British fighter bases and radar stations, to a battle ultimately Britain would win, not Germany. A battle of the bombing of cities. As with the Germans, the bombing of Tokyo by American planes galvanizes the Japanese. The American aircraft carriers must be dealt with. As long as they exist, the Americans will believe that fighting on in the Pacific is wise. So, a two-step plan is established to draw the American carriers out and destroy them. There are secondary goals that are territorial, but the primary goal is to entice the American aircraft carriers to battle where they can be destroyed. The first step is a southward strike towards the big island north of Australia known as New Guinea, what we today call Papua New Guinea. The Japanese have forces in northern New Guinea fighting their way through the jungle mountains of the Owen Stanley Range. However, the Australians have a city in southern Papua New Guinea called Port Moresby. The first step in the Japanese plan is to send an invasion force around New Guinea to land at Port Moresby and take the southern area of New Guinea. This would secure Indonesia against Australian counterattack and would be a good springboard for an invasion of Australia also. Two American aircraft carriers of the four that exist in the Pacific go to stop them. And in the Battle of the Coral Sea, one of our carriers is sunk, USS Lexington, and one of our carriers is very heavily damaged, USS Yorktown. However, Two Japanese carriers, one Japanese carrier is sunk, small one, and two of Japan's Kitabutai carriers are heavily damaged and will not be in any fight for the next few weeks or months. Also, the invasion force, because the American fleet is present, turns back. So the attack on Port Moresby in New Guinea does some of Japan's job in that it indicates where and how strong the American carriers are, but they don't get their invasion of Port Moresby, and they lose two of their carriers, at least for a few weeks. They do, however, sink one of ours. The second phase of the plan is to distract the American fleet northward to the Aleutian Islands. Here's Alaska. The Aleutian Islands extend across the barrier between this side and this side of the map, and here are the islands of Attu and Kiska, near the end of the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese are going to bomb Dutch Harbor, which is the capital of the Aleutian Islands region of Alaska, and they're going to invade Attu and Kiska, with the intent of drawing the American fleet north from Hawaii into battle. However, this is a feint. It's a false attack. It's a distraction. The real attack will happen here, where this big splotch is. Midway Island. Midway Island is at the far end of the Hawaiian Island chain. The Hawaiian Island chain is built by a geographical hotspot, a volcanic hot point in the earth that keeps poking holes in the crust. That's why if you look at a map, the Hawaiian Islands are basically in a line, because the hotspot goes pss, 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 as the plate of the Pacific Ocean moves across it. So right now, the hotspot is under the big island of Hawaii. But Midway is the first island that's still on the surface. Beyond Midway are the Emperor Seamounts, which are also part of this hotspot's legacy. Midway Island has an airbase within bomber range of Pearl Harbor. If the Japanese take Midway, they can permanently bomb, bless you, Pearl Harbor, and set up a much easier invasion of Hawaii. The American fleet cannot avoid taking to the ocean and fighting to protect Midway. It's vital. They'll have to do it. So by drawing the American fleet north towards the Aleutians, it puts them out of position. Then when Japan attacks Midway, the American forces will come in from the north, the Japanese will ambush them and crush them, and there will be no more American aircraft carriers in the Pacific, and maybe the American people will sue for peace. This is what the Japanese hope. However, very quiet. The Americans have broken the Japanese naval code. We are reading their mail. We are reading their messages. Because of this, we know about the attack on Port Moresby in advance, and that's why two of our carriers are there. We know about the attack in the Aleutian Islands on Attu and Kiska and the bombing of Dutch Harbor. We are not going to fall for the distraction. Instead, because we can read their messages, we have to make sure that we read them well. So, we lay a trap. The Japanese are referring to their prime target as Objective AF, Alpha Foxtrot. So, a message is brought to Midway Island by air courier, ordering the radio man to send a message in the clear saying that Midway is having trouble with its freshwater converter, which is a way of converting salt water to fresh water. If the Japanese bite, they will report that Objective AF is having trouble with its freshwater converter, which they do. Now we know that their target is Midway. At least we're pretty darn sure. The truth is that reading their messages is not reading everything they see. It's reading about 1 word in 10 and guessing the rest. Trying to decrypt it using context, using mathematical games, using anything. But we think we know where they're going to strike, and we think we know when. So the remaining two aircraft carriers in the Pacific, USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, are waiting northeast of Midway for the Japanese to come in. USS Yorktown, having returned to Pearl Harbor, has repairs that should take close to 6 months. 2 days after it arrives, it's back at sea. The dock crews do amazing work to patch up the Yorktown and put it back in the fight. So now the Japanese are going to be facing a third American carrier at Midway. Because of the two carriers that were damaged at the battle near Port Moresby, the Battle of Coral Sea, Kido-Butai, which had had 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, and Zoikaku. Akagi? Oh, because I'm not using my thumb. 6. Hello. Shokaku and Zoikaku are out of action because they were damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea. So the Japanese Kido-Butai, their carrier force, only has 4 aircraft carriers. The Americans, Japanese think, only have 2. We really have 3. The Americans, the Japanese think, are going to be caught flat-footed. They're not. The Americans are waiting. Finally, the Japanese planned their battle on the psychology of the American Admiral Bill Halsey, who famously said, when I'm done with them, the Japanese language will only be spoken in hell. This guy is a pugnacious boxer. He's a fighter. He's extremely aggressive. The Japanese battle plan assumes he will be in command of the carriers, but he's in a hospital with a skin condition. You can't make this up. He appoints a very mild-mannered, accountant-type admiral named Spruance to take his place. And Spruance is the psychological opposite of Halsey. Whereas Halsey is bold, Spruance is cautious. Whereas Halsey takes risks, Spruance always calculates the risk. Where the Japanese are going to expect a guy to come out swinging aggressively and taking chances, Spruance is going to play his cards very close to his chest. Spruance is going to be a very different type of opponent. So, here's what happens. The attacks in the Aleutians occur. The Americans do not fall for it. We're already waiting for the Japanese near Midway. The Japanese bomb Midway. The carriers arrive. They bomb Midway. They shoot down Midway's defenses, which include the last Brewster Buffaloes that the U.S. uses in battle. Midway bombers try attacking the Japanese fleet and fail. However, the initial Japanese air raid on Midway does not destroy the fuel depot, nor does it destroy the runway. Midway can still launch aircraft. So, the Japanese commander believes that he needs to have a second strike at Midway with land bombs. And that's what his men are preparing on the decks of the carriers. Then, as the first wave is returning to the Japanese carriers for refueling, word comes that there are American scouting aircraft that only could come from an aircraft carrier. What to do? As the planes are being moved so that the Midway force can land, American torpedo bombers, again, which are from aircraft carriers, not from Midway, launch 3 failed attacks on the Japanese. So the Japanese know somewhere nearby American carriers exist. This is not the way the plan was supposed to be. And if American carriers are nearby, the land bombs that we have prepared for Midway won't work. What we need are torpedoes and bombs designed against ships, armor-piercing bombs. The Japanese admiral has a choice here, a critical choice. Do I launch the planes as they are at Midway with land bombs? Do I launch the planes as they are at the American carriers, even knowing that their weapons are not optimized to fight warships? Or do I take the extra time and rearm our planes with naval weapons designed to hit American warships? That is the decision he makes. So there's chaos on the decks. Planes have landed, they're being rearmed. Torpedoes, bombs for land, and bombs for sea are all on the decks. Now, because of the 3 torpedo attacks, the Japanese fighter airplanes that are to protect the aircraft carriers have gone from their combat air patrols above the carriers down to sea level to shoot down the low-flying torpedo planes. At this moment, 3 groups of American dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown find the Japanese fleet. When the Japanese fighters are in no position to protect, when the Japanese aircraft carrier decks are covered with ammunition. In the dive bomber attack, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers are sunk. Boom, boom, boom. Only one of them survives. It survives enough to launch an attack, and they follow one of the groups of our planes back to the already damaged USS Yorktown. They hit it, damaging it, and they report its position. The remaining carrier then launches the rest of its aircraft in an attack on the Yorktown. Enterprise, Hornet, and Hornet launch an attack on the remaining Japanese carrier. As the sun sets, the last of the 4 aircraft carriers of Kido-Butai, their carrier striking force, is sunk. USS Yorktown is also sunk. The Americans retain 2 aircraft carriers, the Japanese have none. Now, the Japanese do have a massive superiority in surface warships. And what they hope is that the American admiral will be bold, like Halsey would, and press his attack. But Spruance doesn't. Spruance withdraws. The Japanese did not get Midway. The Japanese sank 1 aircraft carrier with the loss of their entire carrier strike force of 4 carriers. It's an American victory. In fact, it's the turning point of the war in the Pacific. Here's why. I don't know if any of you do any pilot training. Some of my students have. In America, being a pilot is considered to be a skilled trade. Anyone can learn to be a pilot. All you need is the time in the aircraft, you need decent eyesight, you need decent coordination, you need decent situational awareness. But in American flight schools, we could train almost anyone to be a decent pilot. Naval aviators are some of the best pilots our country produces, but it's a skilled trade. So what we do in wartime and in peacetime, about 1/3 of our aircraft carrier pilots, our aviators, are on the ships. They spend 1/3 of their time on the ships. And then they spend 1/3 of their time resting and retraining. And then they spend 1/3 of their time training new pilots. And then they go back to the ships. So at any given moment, only 1/3, maybe less than 1/3, of all of our aviators are on our aircraft carriers. The rest are either resting or training, or are training other people. This is not the way it's seen among the Japanese. Among the Japanese, being a pilot is something you start at age 12. It's like being a samurai. You have to meet ridiculously high physical and mental requirements to get accepted at age 12 into pilot training. And then you become a Japanese naval aviator. And then you serve with the fleet. And that's what you do. At any given moment, the vast majority of these incredibly highly trained Japanese naval pilots are on the ships themselves. They do not have a huge reserve of trained people, nor is their system designed to turn large numbers of people into pilots. It's a samurai thing, it's not a skilled trade. So they never think of having to replace these pilots. When at Midway, the Japanese lose 4 aircraft carriers worth of pilots. Where at Coral Sea, they lose more. Where in the battles coming up that I'm about to describe at Guadalcanal, they lose the rest. By the end of 1940, by the spring of 1943, the aircraft carrier pilots that Japan has that are skilled are dead. Very few of them live to pass on any of their knowledge. This is compounded by the Japanese belief in fate. If an American aircraft is shot down, we have submarines in the area ready to spot and pick up pilots. We have scout aircraft looking for downed pilots. We make a real effort to rescue anyone that is shot down by the enemy over the ocean or over land. That's us. The Japanese do not. As far as they're concerned, it is their fate. Their life belongs to the emperor. And if their fate is to die right here, right now, so be it. So, whereas Japanese pilots are occasionally picked up, it is not a major concern. What this means is that by June of 1942, when the Battle of Midway happens, Japanese lose the critical mass of their aircraft carrier pilots. And by the spring of the next year, 1943, they lose the rest. You can have all the aircraft carriers in the world. You can have all the aircraft launchable and landable on aircraft carriers in the world. But if you don't have skilled pilots, it's useless. And their skilled pilots die in battle in 1942 and early 1943. That is the end of any hope of Japan achieving victory. The Midway victory is followed up by the first American counterattack of the war. I gotta again use the map behind me. Sorry, ladies. This is Australia. This is a big American ally. America is over here. So the trade routes and shipping routes to Australia basically follow the line of this stick. The Japanese, who have taken the northern area of Papua New Guinea, take an island chain that extends beyond Papua New Guinea called the Solomon Islands. One of the largest in the South Solomon Islands is the island of Guadalcanal. The Japanese, in July of 1942, are building an airstrip. And that airstrip will allow them to damage or divert a lot of the Australia-America trade hundreds of miles out of its way. It could also be used as a base to conquer New Caledonia and the other islands, ultimately isolating Australia, making it easier for Japan to conquer. We know they're building a landing strip on this jungle island of Guadalcanal. So in August of 1942, the old breed, the 1st Marine Division of the United States Marine Corps, is landed on Guadalcanal and the nearby island of Tulagi. They are ready to fight. These are some of the toughest men we have in our land forces. U.S. Marines tend to be much more aggressive than the average Army soldier. They're not as well equipped. They're certainly not as large a force. But if you're in a fight, having a Marine at your side, you could do a lot worse. The U.S. Marines land on Guadalcanal in August 1942. The Japanese construction forces retreat south into the mountains. We make the airstrip operational. We call it Henderson Field after a pilot that was killed in the Battle of Midway, an American pilot. So now we control the landing strip. However, Guadalcanal is within range of Japan's bombers and ships. There's a base the Japanese have north of New Guinea at a place called Rabaul. So, when our Marines are offloaded, but only a small proportion of their supplies, attacks occur on our aircraft carriers covering their landing. Our aircraft carriers and our ships' landing supplies all leave to avoid being destroyed. When they leave, the Marines have a lot of guys, not as many supplies as they need, not by a long shot. Later, American and Australian cruisers are sent into the area to try to land more supplies. However, the Japanese sink them. In the worst naval defeat in American history up to that point, an entire force of American and Australian cruisers is sunk within a single hour in the middle of a night battle, Battle of Savo Island. The Marines are isolated. The Japanese begin coming in and landing troops and landing supplies by night. The advantage we have is because we control Henderson Field, American aircraft control the sea around Guadalcanal by day. So what happens is, from August through November 1942, is a seesaw battle. By day, we bring in supplies and troops where we can, and we scuttle the heck out of there so that by night we're not in range. By night, the Japanese ship in men and troops and materials, and they try to scuttle out before day comes, so they'll be out of range of our planes at Henderson Field. There are a dozen naval encounters, half a dozen major naval battles around the island of Guadalcanal. In late August, there's a Japanese land attack on the airstrip. It fails. Banzai charge against American machine guns. Comes close to succeeding, fails. In September, there's a major Japanese attack. It fails, but again, at great cost. In October, mid-October, there's a major Japanese attack. It fails, but again comes this close to breaking through. Each time there's a major land attack, there's a major naval battle. The Guadalcanal campaign is settled in terms of the Navy battle in mid-November, when two American battleships go into Japanese-controlled waters around Guadalcanal at night and sink a Japanese battleship and a number of transports. The day before and the day after, the American Air Forces on Guadalcanal sink the ships as they're approaching and as they're grounding. Still, the fight goes on beyond the turning point in November. The fight goes on into December, into January. By February of 1943, the Japanese withdraw from the island of death, the island of starvation. Both the Americans and the Japanese fight the Battle of Guadalcanal in a very similar psychological fashion to the way the Germans and the Russians fight the Battle of Stalingrad. Guadalcanal is at the edge of America's and Japan's supply chains. It happens at the same time, August 42 to February 43. It is a series of bloody clashes. Now, Stalingrad is purely a land-air battle, and it is much more massive in scale than the American-Japanese fight at Guadalcanal. But the American-Japanese fight has many more air components to the battle and also the components of naval warfare, sea battles. All of this means that as Stalingrad was the last German advance in Europe that mattered, the last Japanese advance in World War II that matters is the Battle of Midway, and the first counterattack is the Battle of Guadalcanal. So together, Midway and Guadalcanal are the turning point of the Pacific War. So before you go on, you may ask fairly, if the Japanese can't win the Pacific War as of June 1942, if they can't hold territory in the Pacific as of February 43, why does the war go on? Why does Japan not surrender? Why does Japan not try to negotiate a peace? If you kill enough Americans, they'll go away. That is the calculus of the Japanese military. It is also the calculus of the Chinese military in Korea, of the North Vietnamese army in the Vietnam War, and of the Taliban in Afghanistan and our enemies in Iraq. If you kill enough Americans, we'll go away. It was the strategy of Mohammed Farah Aidid in Mogadishu, Somalia in 1993 in the Black Hawk Down incident. If you kill enough Americans, we'll go away. The Japanese, even without Midway, hold a vast territory. They may not be able to advance anymore, but they don't have to surrender, they think. All they have to do is be willing to fight and die to protect the outer island ring, then the middle island chains, then the inner island chains, then the homeland. You make each and every battle costly in American lives. Your men don't surrender. They fight to the death. They fight in tunnels. They fight in pillboxes. They feign surrender and then blow a grenade up, killing themselves and the Americans. They force the Americans to go into the holes to kill the Japanese with flamethrowers, because the Japanese will not surrender. The theory is if you kill enough Americans, we'll go away. All you have to do is slaughter so many Americans that the American people decide it's not worth it to continue the war, and they win. They hold the territory. Now, Pearl Harbor made that impossible. The American people were not going to negotiate with the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. If the Japanese surrendered, fine. Otherwise, the war is going on no matter what the cost. But this calculus is something that, as Americans today, you need to know about. Did it work with the Japanese? No. But ultimately, 2 atom bombs helped seal that deal. Did it help in Korea? Almost, but no. Ultimately, the Americans demonstrate to the Chinese by 1953 that we will fight to hold a line on a map indefinitely. And the Chinese accept a ceasefire. And it's the Chinese that count in North Korea, not Kim Jong-un. In Vietnam, for the first time, that strategy works. With the help of a credulous American left that's pro-communist, the communist guerrillas in South Vietnam and the North Vietnamese communists are able to kill enough Americans so that even though we win almost every battle, we leave. And when we leave, they win. In the war on terror for the last 20 years, our terrorist enemies understand they can't beat us in open battle, but they can outlast us. President George W. Bush sent troops to Afghanistan and Iraq. He did not send troops to Iran, which was the key to victory. President Obama tried reducing the commitment of Americans in Iraq, but held on in Afghanistan. President Trump reduced our forces in both areas, but didn't quite leave. President Biden is considering completely abandoning Afghanistan. Actually, Iraq has been largely abandoned. And in all cases where we abandon the war without victory, our enemies come back and take power. If you kill enough Americans, we will go away. That is the calculation so many of our enemies not only have used, but continue to use. So Japan will go on fighting. Where we are is item D in your notes. AD 1943 to 1945, Allied advances. Number 1, the European theater of operations, the Mediterranean. So, in the Mediterranean, the Germans are being pressed from the west by Anglo-American forces, from the east by British forces. Alamein gave the British a victory and momentum. However, the Germans have never fought the Americans, not in World War II. And the Americans in the West are under British command. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass, one of the entrances to Tunisia, the American army is hit hard by the German Afrika Korps. Our troops throw their rifles into the air and run. Americans are slaughtered, it's a disgrace, and the British start calling the Americans our Italians, because the Italians are sort of cowardly compared to the Germans, and they're not very good soldiers. but there are a lot of them. The British start looking down on our troops as being cowardly and not very good. We get a new commander, General George S. Patton. General Patton puts some starch in the shorts of the American soldier, starts kicking bottom, and plans a new set of battles. Patton turns defeat at Kasserine into victory, and Patton's forces and Montgomery's forces race to see who can capture or destroy the German forces in Tunisia. Nearly 1 million men surrender in Tunisia. So North Africa is captured by the Allies. Now the Allies are going to continue moving north towards Germany in the Mediterranean. So in 1943, the invasion of Sicily occurs. The Americans under Patton, the British under Montgomery, are going to land in Sicily with the goal of taking the city of Messina, right near the Straits of Messina, which is a way into Italy. Again, there is intense competition between the British and the American soldier, and between the British and the American general. Ultimately, by being completely merciless to his troops, General Patton wins the race to Messina. General Montgomery arrives a day later. However, in the course of this battle, Patton has a public relations nightmare. Patton's an odd fellow. He believes in reincarnation. He believes that he is an eternal warrior born again and again to fight in battle. He believes he was there when Carthage was destroyed. And Carthage is in these areas. Patton also believes that anyone who isn't brave is useless, but that wounded soldiers are almost sacred. So he travels to a couple of aid stations in the mountains of Sicily to put Purple Hearts on soldiers. That's the American medal for being wounded in battle. And he's looking at guys with legs blown off, arms blown off, faces burned to a crisp, people who are in body casts who can barely breathe. And then he sees this guy sitting on his bunk crying. "What's wrong with you, soldier?" "I just can't take it anymore." The guy has battle fatigue, what we would call post-traumatic stress. Patton does not believe in post-traumatic stress disorder. He calls the guy a coward, slaps his helmet off, and says, "I don't care how you feel. You are not going to get out of the fight. Other men are afraid. They fight. You're going back to the front. I don't care how you feel. You're going back to the front. Get this coward out of here." The press is there. They see it. A second incident happens basically of the same type. Every gentle soul in America erupts in horror and outrage. Enemy soldiers can kill our boys, but American generals can't slap them. How dare he call a guy suffering from battle fatigue a coward? So, after Sicily, Patton is sidelined. The Germans, however, believe that Patton is the best Allied general, so this is going to be used by the Allies to trick him. Come back to that later. Then Italy is invaded. Now, when Italy is invaded, the Italian government surrenders to the Allies. Mussolini is put in prison. But the Germans don't like that. So the Germans invade Italy. The Italians surrender, but the Germans march south. And south of Rome, a line of forts and defenses are set up by the Germans that are going to stymie the Anglo-American forces. The linchpin of this southern set of forts is the monastery on the top of Monte Cassino. This is the monastery where Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper is painted, on the wall of the cafeteria, the door underneath. American forces and British forces try going up that hill several times. It is a slaughterhouse. American bombers are sent in, when the general finally says, "To hell with the art, I'm sick of my guys bleeding for an old painting. Destroy the monastery." Now, this is after 3 infantry attacks uphill against German machine guns. So the bombers flatten the monastery. 2 things, though. Number one, by God's grace, one of the few parts of the monastery that wasn't destroyed was the wall with the painting on it. There are machine gun holes in it at the end of World War II, but the painting and the wall are still intact. The fresco is still there. The second thing is that the rubble gives the Germans just as good cover as they had before, maybe better. Like leveling Stalingrad, turning the target into a rubble pile helps the defenders fight. Doesn't make it harder for them to. Eventually, we take Monte Cassino, but it is a slow slog, World War I style bloodbath. So, the plan is, what if we go around, since we have Navy power, and land at a place called Anzio near Rome? We'll be behind the German lines, and that'll give us an advantage. However, when we land at Anzio, the American commander, who's afraid of being outfoxed, instead of landing and marching right on Rome, which might have worked because of surprise, he spends days fortifying his beachhead. So, of course, what happens is the Germans realize where he is, realize he's not advancing, and just box him in. So Anzio becomes this little pustule of Allied territory in German Italy for a while, and it's another bloodbath. Eventually, a couple of days before the D-Day attacks, the Gothic line breaks and Rome is freed, and then this same fortification mentality continues in North Italy. Italy is basically one big bloodletting. It is not a place for an easy Allied attack. It's a stalemate. I think what we will do is leave it there, and next time we'll continue in the Eastern Theater of Operations to the end of the war, hopefully. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Okay, thank you for your attention.